Hello everybody, how are you doing today? I hope you're doing well. I'm not doing too bad. I've been pretty busy over the last couple of weeks, mostly doing one-to-one sessions over Skype, and a big part of that for me is doing image reviews of other photographers' work. And when I look through their work, I do tend to spot a lot of common mistakes that a lot of people make. I'm only able to spot those mistakes because, of course, they are mistakes that I've made myself in the past. I've also had reason to look through my back catalogue recently. I've produced some videos where I've been looking back at my older work, and I've also been producing some location maps for a friend of mine. And of course, as I've been going through my work, I have spotted images that have got the same mistakes. Now, one of the ways that we can really improve our photography, really improve our compositions, is to eradicate a lot of these common mistakes. And by doing that, we can put a big improvement into our work. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look back at 10 images that I've taken in the last 3 to 4 years and look at some of the common mistakes I've made so that you can eradicate them from your own photography. Okay, so let's jump straight into it and look at the first image. And this photo was taken at Loughrig Tarn in the Central Lake District, and I was there last summer with a friend of mine called Alex, and it wasn't really about photography that morning. It was about hanging out with a mate and just enjoying the beautiful weather. It was absolutely gorgeous morning. But as we were leaving, I did take this image looking across the tarn at the reflections on the other side. And the big problem with this image is it lacks a primary subject that can act as a focal point. Now what happens when I look at this image is that my eye goes straight to the trees and the reflections on the other side, but then it starts to scan left and right looking for something to lock onto. Now most landscape photographs will benefit by having a primary subject that can act as a focal point, give the viewer something that they can lock onto. Now if you're not sure if your image has a primary subject, always ask yourself the question, what is this a photo of? And including something that can act as a focal point should start to improve your landscape photographs. Next up we have this image taken at 9 Standards Rig. Now 9 Standards Rig is a hill in the Yorkshire Dales, and it's called the 9 Standards because there are 9 of these stone cairns. And in this photograph what I've done is I've isolated 2 of them. And this photo has the exact opposite problem to the first one. And there isn't just one primary subject, there's 2. And the eye doesn't know which one of these to look at. And the big problem is that they're both the same size. They both have the same visual weight. And so the eye cannot decide which of these is most important, and therefore which of these to look at first, which of these to concentrate on. Now I did take another image of these 2 cairns, but this time I included a third one in the foreground. And this is much bigger, and therefore the eye can make the decision that this is the primary subject, and this is what it should look at first. And eventually the eye will lead off into the distance and look at these 2 cairns in the background. So this second image is a far stronger composition, just because that primary subject is a lot more obvious to the viewer. My third image was taken at Otterfield on Derwent Water, and I was there a couple of autumns ago with my friend Tom, who I used to go to school with. And he was up for the weekend, and we visited a few locations around Derwent Water. And this image benefits from having that strong primary subject, obviously this branch, the very famous Otterfield tree. It's even got a secondary subject, the island where the eye can lead off into the distance, and that creates depth to the image. But this is probably one of my biggest regrets when I've cocked up a composition. And the big problem with this is that the branch cuts into the mountain behind it. So when we're taking an image that has a strong foreground and background, one of the things that we want to do is to try to create separation between the 2. We don't want edges cutting into each other. Now, had I lowered the tripod ever so slightly, the tree would have been against the sky and not cutting into the mountain. And if I'd have done that, then this probably would have been one of my favourite shots ever. But as I did, I cocked it up. Unfortunately, this has become probably my biggest mistake that I've made in the last 3 years. Now this fourth image could also be another example of not creating enough separation between your subject and the background. This was taken at Glencoyne near Ullswater looking towards Sheffield Pike, and the primary subject of this image is supposed to be the tree right in the centre of the frame. But because it has very similar colourings to the background, it sort of blends into the background. But that's not why I want to look at this image. Now, I do workshops with my good friend James Burns, and we're always saying that we could probably just give this one piece of advice when we're on workshops, and that is to watch the edges of your frame. If you look at the right hand side of this image, you will see that there's a lot of sheep that are very close to the right hand side, and even in some cases I think I've just clipped one. Now, what you really want to do is try and keep the edges of your frame as clean as possible. And in this case, I could have just cloned those out, and that would have worked absolutely fine. But this is something that I'm actually quite good at. It's actually quite difficult for me to find an image that has distractions around the edge, because it's something I'm normally quite good at, but I missed it on this occasion. And I had to include something like that in this video because it's such a common issue. So when you're taking an image, particularly if you're using live view or a mirrorless camera, have a quick scan around the edges of your frame and just make sure there are no distracting elements, or particularly no elements that you've just clipped. Now, there's a really good story behind my next image. I was down staying in Devon with my good friend Julian Baird. I'd gone down for the summer solstice, and the plan was that we were going to do a sunset shoot and a sunrise shoot. And after the sunset shoot, which was at the Daymark Tower, I then drove along with Gareth Danks, who was also with us, and we parked up close to the Start Point lighthouse, which is this image, and we camped overnight. And Gareth had his tent, and I decided to sleep in the back of the Land Rover, which was very, very uncomfortable. And basically I spent 5 hours staring at the roof of the Land Rover, and then I had to get up and photograph this lighthouse. And I was really tired, and I knew I was making this mistake at the time, but I just couldn't be bothered. And obviously the big problem with this image is that I have sat the horizon right on top of my primary subject. And that's a big no-no. When you're composing an image, what you want to do is you want to make sure that there are no tangential lines in your image. So what happens here is we have the horizon, and then we have the lighthouse that runs off at a tangent, a 90-degree angle from that. And you want to avoid that if at all possible. So the best way to improve this image, well, there's two things you could do. First, you could try and get higher, so that you're looking down on the lighthouse more, so that the horizon sits above it. That's one thing. But better, if you can do this, it makes a much, much, much stronger composition, is actually to get your subject to break the horizon. So if I'd have gone a lot closer to the lighthouse and got lower down, we could have had the lighthouse towering above us and breaking the horizon, and that would have made a much better shot. But this shot is completely ruined, it's completely useless, because I've set that horizon bang on the top of the subject. My next mistake features one of the most recognisable views in the Lake District. This is the view of the Langdale Pikes from Side Pike. This is a classic shot, a classic view. And the big problem here, my subject is the Langdale Pikes themselves, but my composition is far too tight. I haven't given enough breathing space around the subject. Now, it's great to have the subject in the image, it's great, and it's great to focus in on it. I think filling the frame with interest is one of the first things that we learn as photographers, but this has gone too far. What I haven't done with the subject is to provide enough space around it to give it some context, to show the surrounding area. And so I decided that I would head back, and I went back a month or two later, and I took this shot. And this is obviously of the same subject, but I've shot a lot wider this time. It included some of the valley floor and some of the valley as it heads off into the distance on the left-hand side. And so this image, this composition adds more context to the primary subject. And when we're looking at combining a primary subject with its context, that really helps us to tell a story with our image. And so this second shot is actually a far better composition, and this is the composition that I will continue to focus on in the future when I'm trying to get the light perfect for this shot. One of the things that we can do to improve our photographs is to include some form of foreground interest, and by doing so, that will give our images a bit more of a three-dimensional feel. And so this image was taken on top of Scout Scar, and the primary subject is supposed to be the mushroom that sits on top of the scar. And I've included these bushes in the foreground to try and give the image a bit of depth, but they're so distracting. I find that my attention is drawn away from the mushroom onto the bushes, which are not the primary subject, they're just there to give it depth. And I think the big problem with these, and the reason why they're so distracting, is they're so big in the frame and the mushroom is so much smaller. So if I'd have been able to find a way to make them smaller in the frame and then make the mushroom bigger so that the eye tends to go towards the mushroom and not the bushes, that would have massively improved this image. But I actually think that this probably isn't an image here, just because they are so distracting. And probably the best thing to do would have been just focus on the mushroom itself and find something else to add depth to it, because these bushes are just too strong and they drag the eye away from the primary subject. Now, at the other end of the spectrum from distracting foregrounds is boring foregrounds, and this image was taken on Hallin Fell, and the view towards Pooley Bridge is one of my favourites, and I find that my eye in this image goes straight to Ullswater, straight to that view, it completely ignoring the cairn that I've included in the bottom right hand corner, and that means it's completely pointless. It doesn't add anything to the composition. Now, when you include foreground in your image, what you want is for the eye to go to the foreground first and then lead off into the distance. And if your primary subject is in the distance, then what happens is it will lead off there and your eye will settle there. And that's very effective. What it does is it creates flow through your image. But if you find that your foreground, you're not looking at it, it's not adding anything to the image, once again, you're probably best off eliminating it completely. But something else I've been trying to do more recently is to try to create a lot more balance in my images. And if you take a look at this image taken at Tarn House, you can see it is far too heavily weighted towards the right hand side. Now, it was a glorious morning and I quite like the tones and the colours in this image and the detail in this image. And my primary subject, although it's not a particularly strong subject, is actually the moon and the moon reflecting in the surface of the tarn. But we have these huge trees on the right hand side that are leading in, and they are far too heavy. It's far too much of the composition. It takes the eye away from the primary subject. And there isn't a great deal of interest in there either, which is another big problem with the image. So when you're taking a photograph, you want to try and create balance. You don't want it to be too heavily weighted to one side or the other. The exception to that rule is if it is your primary subject that's unbalancing the image. And that can still work. So obviously, if you're taking a picture of something that's very strong in the frame, it's obviously a good technique if you apply to the rule of thirds to push that off to one side. So that's the exception to this rule. But if it isn't your primary subject that's unbalancing your frame, then you really want to try and change your composition so that that's a lot smaller and a lot less distracting. Now, my final image is an example of one of my pet hates in landscape photography, and that is the over-dependency on a colourful sky. Now, this shot was taken at Kelders overlooking Ullswater, and as a composition it's okay, it's nothing particularly exciting. I mean, if this shot works, it's because it's got that amazing sky, it looks fantastic. But for me, a composition, if it doesn't work without a colourful sky, then it probably doesn't work with one. And the other big problem that I have with really colourful skies is that it's the biggest distraction in landscape photography. We spend so much time tuning our compositions, trying to eliminate as many distracting elements as possible, and then we go and try and put a really colourful sky in it, and of course the eye is drawn to that immediately. And so that, for me, is a real problem with a lot of landscape photography. And I think that the big issue here is that this isn't a particularly strong composition. This isn't a composition I would ever consider to try and get into my portfolio. And just adding a colourful sky doesn't really make the image work any better. I do have a bonus image for you. As I was scanning through my photos, I did come across this one. And I think this is an example of including the wrong subject. If you are going to take a great landscape photograph and you want to include a fantastic subject, then it's probably best to try and find something that isn't Brian Blessed's love child. Now, if you don't know who this is my friend Mali Davies, and this was taken on the top of haystacks when I was out with him and James Burns, and it was a fabulous day, and Mali is great fun to be around. And this is just a little bit of a joke. I'm just throwing this in for his amusement. But yeah, this is an example of the wrong subject. And like I say, Mali's a great guy. He's a bit like Tigger on acid, very excitable, great fun to spend some time with, if not a little exhausting. And when this is all over, when lockdown is finished, I really do hope that I can catch up with Mali again and we can spend a bit of time up on the fells. So there you go, those are 10 compositional mistakes that I have made over the last 3 or 4 years. One of the easiest ways to improve our photography is to eliminate as many of these mistakes as we possibly can. And if you can do that, you should start producing much, much better photographs. You'll see a big improvement in your photography in general.